The purpose of this executive briefing is to help business leaders manage the risk to their firm caused by this week's breach at 100,000 other organisations. The purpose is to help you mitigate harms to your organisation if one of your important suppliers is among those 100,000 firms that have been breached. As of today, Monday the 8th of March, the Washington Post this morning has said the attack is morphing into a global crisis, but it's important not to overreact. We estimate at Cyber Rescue that of the 200 large enterprises that we advise on cyber risk, the risk of actual harm to their customers is low, typically around 1% this month, which I'll elaborate on later. This small risk is because some of your smaller suppliers may be among the breached firms, and therefore we're advising that a total investment of probably a maximum of 6 hours across several people is a proportionate response, and we'll detail the actions to help engage with your suppliers to mitigate their risk shortly. The threat to your suppliers is itself small, but if as a large enterprise you have a lot of them, there's a probability of perhaps 70% that at least one of your suppliers has been breached by the Hafnium group in the last 5 days. And that creates two specific threats: a 10% risk that such a breached supplier could have your data used maliciously for extortion or a fraud campaign later this year. A similar but less likely risk is that a breached supplier will actually be prevented from delivering service to you, denial of service or ransomware, depending on what further malware, what further software could be injected by the hackers into your supplier's systems now that they have implemented backdoors at so many thousands of companies. The calculation of business risk to a typical member of the Cyber Rescue Alliance with perhaps 1,000 to 10,000 employees themselves is that given how many suppliers you have, there's a 70% chance that either that availability or confidentiality breach will happen, so 8.4% overall. But then you're probably only worried if that happens at a really key supplier, a material or strategic supplier, and if roughly 1 in 8 of your suppliers is put in that category, you might be looking at about a 1% risk this month of significant harm to your customers through the Hafnium activity. So you want to make a proportionate response to this small but non-zero risk. And we recommend that a proportionate response will take about 6 hours of effort across all of your firm to measure, mitigate, and crucially manage that risk. Firstly, as a senior executive, you should delegate responsibility to a colleague, then ask them to document the risk assessment for your firm, and then finally come back to you to decide on any further steps, if any, that may need to be taken. And we can support you in doing that. As a member, we can help you to identify those of your existing suppliers that are most at risk of being breached. We can assist those suppliers to understand, for example, that while patching is necessary, it's actually not sufficient for this particular breach. And crucially, we can help you advise your other stakeholders, indeed regulators, investors, independent non-executives or senior execs, your colleagues, to understand the business implications and to use this development perhaps as an opportunity to be more operationally resilient for the next major breach that may occur in the press very soon. Let me now go on to a more detailed briefing around Hafnium's impact on cyber risk at your suppliers. As of today, the 8th of March, media are getting more and more interested and certain government and regulatory organisations are themselves being affected. For example, the European Banking Authority, the EBA, said on Sunday that it believed it had probably been breached by Hafnium itself. The media have issued various reports. On Saturday that the Wall Street Journal was suggesting it may have been over 250,000 firms that have been hacked, and MIT has highlighted that it's not just the Hafnium group now that firms should worry about. At least 4 other hacking groups are using the vulnerabilities across firms that have still not patched. The German government, interestingly, has written to 9,000 medium-sized firms highlighting the risk, while the White House has used the podium to communicate that this active threat is something that all organisations should certainly be concerned about. And of course, it's only since Tuesday, when Microsoft issued emergency security updates, that Hafnium massively escalated the rate of their attack, now to tens of thousands of organisations a day, as opposed to a few dozen when they began, interestingly, on the 6th of January, the day that some of us were watching the rioters inside the US Capitol. So if that's the when, let's think about the how. To complete this breach, hackers are exploiting 4 vulnerabilities announced on the 2nd of March that apply only to a limited extent the 2010 version, but particularly the 2013, 2016 and 2019 versions of the Microsoft Exchange Server software that many small and medium-sized businesses use to run their email. And those vulnerabilities allow hackers to authenticate, run a system, and then write any files they want onto your server, your big computer in the basement typically. If they could make an untrusted connection into that exchange, they were then able to view emails and, crucially, install a backdoor so they would have future access even after that known vulnerability was breached. They can then zip and extract emails to read through at their leisure and think about how they want to use their power in the future. And that's the crucial unknown. What will Hafnium decide to do, not just with the data they've stolen, but the power that they now have through the backdoors they've implemented on so many organisations' IT systems. How many IT systems, how many firms are vulnerable? Depending on the sources you look at, there are certainly over 800,000 firms that use Microsoft Exchange Server for their email, and according to very reputable specialists like Rapid7 and Crowdsource, there's over 150,000 firms that are vulnerable, and indeed at this weekend at least a quarter of them had still not been patched, with the range of estimates of how many firms have actually been breached by Hafnium ranging between 60,000 and 250,000 around the world. Who are those firms that have been breached? Well, typically small firms. Certainly over 2/3 employ under 50 staff, and certainly under 1/3 employ less than 25 staff. Often in business services, but also factories, manufacturing and other technical industry sectors, often based in the US, Germany, the UK, with a smaller number in France and Netherlands, and some reports are highlighting Russia and a few other countries as having a significant number of vulnerable servers. Now, why are Hafnium doing this? Well, they are believed with a high probability by the US government and Microsoft themselves as being an advanced persistent threat group that's based in China. They are believed to have targeted a range of entities that state-sponsored groups have been considered to have attacked in the past from China: defence contractors, law firms, universities, NGOs, organisations involved in politics, defence, human rights, as well as over the last year, infectious disease research, particularly around COVID, of course, which helps us conclude, as I'm sure you have, that Hafnium is probably not primarily motivated by a desire for pure and immediate financial gain, in the way that some state-sponsored groups, such as in North Korea, are alleged to be in their ransomware attacks and criminal attacks on large financial organisations, for example. We believe that the motivation is not pure financial gain, partly, of course, because there has not yet been evidence of ransomware being widely deployed through those backdoors that Hafnium has implemented. So what next? Well, for your suppliers, they need to be doing the same thing that your technical colleagues have, I'm sure, already successfully implemented. Know whether they have the vulnerable software, and then crucially, it's essential that they understand that with this breach, simply patching is of course necessary but not sufficient. Yes, take any unpatched servers they still have offline until the protections have been implemented. Of course, maintain backups of critical systems as always, but because there is a quite high probability that some of those smaller organisations were breached before they were able to patch, they could use the Latvian Ministry of Defence's script that's available on GitHub to check whether a backdoor has been implemented by the hackers and do various scans and threat hunting activities to the extent that they are capable. At Cyber Rescue, we work closely with an amazing organisation, Security Scorecard, that has investors like Google Ventures behind them, that is able to highlight which firms are most at risk of a breach. I remember over the last few months, many firms have questioned our members, why is Microsoft Corporation scoring lower than its peers like SAP or Salesforce or Amazon Web Services? Well, if you actually look at the data and the number of vulnerabilities, there's some clear evidence there, but that's perhaps for another conversation. For now, I would just conclude by highlighting that a proportionate response to the perhaps 1% chance that a large enterprise's customers will be harmed is 6 hours or less of effort this week. Start by delegating responsibility to a probably fairly junior colleague, ideally in procurement, privacy or risk rather than IT, so they'll focus on the business issues. Ask that individual to document your risk response and proposed activities so that you can then decide what you might want to do later this year based on your risk assessment. So with that, thank you very much. Stay safe.